There's been talk over the past few years of a third fight between Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank. Both guys are what, 50 years old, in their 50s, approaching their 50s. I'm not exactly sure of their ages at this point, but I watched all their major fights during the 90s. I saw their two fights that they had. The first fight was a classic, the second fight was a bit of a dud. That was at Old Trafford, I believe, Manchester United's football stadium. And after all these years, once they reached a certain age, they were long retired, they started talking about having one more fight between them. But Nigel Benn seems to have let go of that idea. He says Chris Eubank is too difficult to deal with in terms of sorting out the terms of the fight. And he has now announced on IFL TV in an interview he did, I believe it was yesterday, that he's actually going to be fighting Steve Collins now. That he called up Steve Collins and said, Steve, do you want to fight? And Steve said, yeah. So we might be getting the third fight between Nigel Benn and Steve Collins. When Nigel Benn fought Steve Collins, he was a shell of his former self. The Nigel Benn who fought Steve Collins was nothing like the Nigel Benn who fought Gerald McClellan. And really, it was the McClellan fight which ended Nigel Benn's career. He was never the same after that. That was one of the most obvious instances of when a guy is not the same after a particular fight. And it was a fight that he won. The McClellan fight was so brutal, it took so much out of him that he just wasn't the same physically or emotionally again after that. You could tell in his fight that he had with Nardiello. You could tell in his fight which he lost to Sugar Boy Malinga, a guy he'd beaten previously. I believe it. Had he beaten Malinga? Yeah, I believe he had. I believe that was the second fight he'd had with Malinga, and I think he beat him before. My memory doesn't always serve me right, but I believe he did fight Malinga twice, and that was the second one. I know Roy Jones also fought Malinga. Eubank also fought Malinga. A lot of guys fought Sugar Boy Malinga. Anyway, it wasn't the same after the McClellan fight. But all these years later, he's looking to revisit one of the old chapters, fighting Steve Collins. I don't know if this fight will come off. I don't know if the British Border Boxing Control will license either of these two guys. But there are many foreign licensing bodies. I mean, you remember when David Haye fought Derek Chisora, that was licensed by the Luxembourg Boxing Commission. Perhaps one of those smaller European countries will license Nigel Benn versus Steve Collins. Now, I can understand there being an age limit for fighters, professional fighters. I don't believe there is, but I can understand if one was introduced, at least provisionally, because you don't want a 50-year-old man going in there with a 25-year-old man, really and truly. I know it happened recently with Joe Smith Jr. fighting Bernard Hopkins, but Hopkins is really an exception. Generally, you don't want a guy that old going in with someone that young. It's going to end badly. It's going to be ugly. But in this case, with Nigel Benn and Steve Collins, both of them are around the same age. They're both guys who have fought each other before. So how much damage can they really do to each other? If you understand what I'm saying. It's not like it's a 25-year-old in there with a 50-year-old man inflicting serious damage. You've got two old boys. So can they really hurt each other any more than two 25-year-olds could hurt each other, relatively speaking? I'm not saying one way or the other which the case is. I'm not sure. It's not often that I watch fights where the guys are this old. In fact, I've never watched a fight with two 50-year-old men. Not in the boxing ring anyway, maybe on the streets. So let me know what you think of this, people. Nigel Benn versus Steve Collins. Collins himself has been flirting with the idea of fighting Roy Jones Jr. for many years. He wanted to fight Roy Jones when he was still an active boxer and a world champion. But even years and years after the fact, Roy Jones is still fighting. And Steve Collins still holds this grudge against Roy Jones, and he's been talking about fighting him. Well, Jones versus Collins ain't going to happen. Benn versus Eubank ain't going to happen. So I guess we're going to get Benn versus Collins. Let me know what you think of it all in the comment section below, people. It's happening. I'm out.